Hello lovely friend, welcome to my studio and welcome to my first slow stitching vlog for 2024. It's such a pleasure to invite you into the studio and spend some time with me for some gentle slow stitching and mindfulness. Please settle in with a cup of tea or drink of choice, a crafty project, and let's have a chat and unwind with some slow stitching. I love to set myself up with a cozy spot to sit and stitch. Most often, I sew at night in front of the TV, watching YouTube. I set my sewing up next to me on the lounge and have my tea and treats next to me on a side table. I have a comfy cushion behind me and my feet are up on an ottoman, ready for a blissful sewing session. When I'm in my studio, my setup looks a little different. I sit at my big table and set the scene with table linens, a vase of fresh or faux flowers, some of my treasures, my pincushion and other notions I need. I make myself a pot of tea and select one of my vintage teacup sets from my collection. You could call this romanticising my stitching time, and I'm perfectly okay with that. In fact, this year, I plan to do a lot more romanticising my daily life. Making everything look pretty around me brings me joy. Using vintage tableware brings me joy. Having flowers around me brings me joy. Turning life's mundane tasks into enjoyable ones through a little bit of romanticism, I see no harm in doing that. Today, as we sit and stitch together, I am working on my vintage patches quilt, making more 4-patch blocks to incorporate into my quilt. I love working on this project. One, because I adore all the vintage floral fabrics, Liberty prints and gingham fabrics I'm using. But also, working with squares is a pleasant change from hexagons. When I create my 4-patch blocks, I use a chain piecing technique. I first stitch 2 adjacent squares together, making sure I use a locking knot at the start and end of the stitched edge. Then, without tying off and breaking my thread, I stitch the next 2 adjacent squares together while holding the previous 2 squares. To finish my 4-patch block, I run my thread to the middle, open the squares out and stitch the 4 squares together. Piecing in this way saves time, as I'm not having to stop and knot and restart all over again. Cottage flowers. The cottage homes of England, yes I know, how picturesque their moss and weather stain, their golden thatch whose squared eaves shadows throw on whitewashed wall and deep sunk lattice pane, the kindly nature that still masks decay, with flowers and hues only less fair than flowers, all these I know. Tom Taylor from Old Cottages. The indulgence of the Victorians in sentimentality helped the language of flowers reach its zenith in the late 19th century. There was at the same time renewed interest in the traditional cottage garden style, and a school of painting arose in England, where all was roses and hollyhocks, charming thatch, bonneted children and slumbering cats. The most popular artists were Helen Allingham, Arthur Claude Strachan, and Beatrice Parsons, whose work also illustrated many gardening books of the period. In fact, True cottage gardens were practical plots that incorporated fruit, vegetables and herbs to feed the family and provide medicinal remedies. The picturesque paintings, therefore, had a poignancy in masking and romanticising the true living conditions of cottages. The style and the sentiment of the cottage garden school of art spread to the colonies. In Australia, for example, the artist John Glover in 1840 painted a portrait of his cottage amid the wilds of Tasmania. In the foreground of the tiny house, which is dwarfed by space and sky, is a long cottage garden with hollyhocks, broom, roses and blossoms that defy the limitless expanse of the New World. The fashion for cottage gardens, which did much to preserve old species of flowers, has had a significant revival in recent years. As English garden historian Anne Scott James writes, the original spirit of cottage gardening is perhaps truer today, when we use our gardens hard, labour in them ourselves, grow vegetables as though hunger were knocking at the door, and have a primitive longing to be self-sufficient. One of the things I love about English paper piecing is that cutting your fabric doesn't need to be as accurate like it does with machine piecing. Provided you have a minimum of a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side of your template, you really can't go wrong, no matter how wonky or uneven your seam allowance is. With most shapes and sizes of shapes, I tend to aim for a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. This little bit extra gives me a bit more room to move, and I find makes basting a bit easier also. I prepare my fabric for EPP depends on the type of project, how many fabrics I'm using, and the shape. For vintage patches, I'm cutting strips of fabric and then cutting these strips down into squares, using my rotary cutter and rulers. This definitely makes for a quicker cutting process. You might wonder why I am choosing English paper piecing method to create my 4-patch blocks. It would be far quicker to piece these together on the machine and create my quilt that way. Hand basting the shapes and hand sewing is definitely more labour intensive, but for me it is far more enjoyable than sitting at my sewing machine for hours, not to mention all of the pressing of seams with the iron. EPP means my seams are always pressed on the back. I can sit and happily stitch without the need to be constantly getting up and down. Normally the only time I get to sit and stitch is at night. I like to get comfy on the sofa, watch something on TV and slowly stitch away. I don't want to be sitting at my sewing machine. Of course, I chose this method to create this quilt because of the peace and joy it brings me. As I sew each pretty square together, I get to admire the fabric. I can transport myself to another time where women of the past sat in quiet contemplation with their companions and sewed together, creating not just utilitarian items of necessity, but beautiful items to be admired by others. Rose, Queen of Flowers. What's in a name that which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet? William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. The rose is the universal symbol of love for the Western world, an undisputed queen of flowers. A person may not know another flower by name, but as the American writer Gertrude Stein surreptitiously put it early this century, rose is a rose is a rose. A bunch of red roses remains the most common demonstration of the language of flowers. To Greeks and Romans, the rose symbolized joyous celebration, and it was the emblem of Aphrodite and Venus, their goddess of love. In Greek mythology, the red rose was said to have sprung from the blood of the handsome hero Adonis at his death. According to the Romans, Venus blushed when Jupiter chanced upon her bathing, and the white rose became henceforth red, mirroring her modesty. The rose was seen as the maiden protecting her virginity with thorns, and as a symbol of transient beauty. The far-off, most secret and inviolate rose of W.B. Yeats. The romantic rose has been the national emblem of many countries, including Czechoslovakia, England, Iran, Poland and Romania, and saw active duty as the emblem of the opposing sides in the War of the Roses, 1455 to 1485. This was the language of flowers in battle. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York. When the two families were finally united by marriage, the two roses were combined into the Tudor rose, which is still a heraldic symbol. Roses figure, too, in children's rhymes, most memorably in Ring a rosy, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. This rhyme and circular dance was developed during the plague to help children understand the deaths of families and friends. The second half of the chorus referring to the sneezing, which was a symptom of the plague. An American version has it ashes, ashes, we all fall down, relating to wartime. The rose is the honour and beauty of flowers. The rose is the care and love of spring. The rose is the pleasure of the heavenly powers. The boy of fair Venus, Cytherea's darling, doth wrap his round with garlands of rose, when to the dances of the graces he goes. And Thesis, a poet of ancient Greece, Verses of a Rose, quoted in John Gerald's Herbal, 1597. To a garden full of posies cometh one to gather flowers, and he wanders through its bowers, toying with the wanton roses, who uprising from their beds, hold on high their shameless heads, with their pretty lips a-pouting, never doubting, that for Cytherean posies he would gather aught but roses. W.S. Gilbert, Only Roses. Ah! See the virgin rose, how sweetly she doth first press forth with bashful modesty. That fairer seems the less ye see her may. Lo, see soon after how more bold and free her bed bosom she doth broad display. Lo, see soon after how she fades and falls away. Edmund Spenser, unidentified fragment. Oh, no man knows through what wild centuries roves back the rose. Walter de la Mare, All That's Past. And the roses, rising out of the grass, tangled round the sundial, wreathing the tree trunks and hanging from their branches, climbing up the walls and spreading over them with long garlands falling in cascades. They came alive day by day, hour by hour. Fair fresh leaves and buds, tiny at first, but swelling and working magic until they burst and uncurled into cups of scent, delicately spilling themselves over their brims and filling the garden air. Frances Hodgson Burnett, The Secret Garden. The Telltale Flowers. And has the spring's all-glorious eye no lesson to the mind? The birds that cleave the golden sky, things to the earth resigned, wild flowers that dance to every wind, do they no memory leave behind? Flowers, the very name of flowers, that bloom in the wood and glen, brings spring to me in winter's hours, and childhood's dreams again. The primrose on the woodland lea was more than gold and lands to me. The violets by the woodland side are thick as they could thrive. I've talked to them with childish pride, as things that were alive. I find them now in my distress. They seem as sweet, yet valueless. The cowslips on the meadow lea, how have I run for them? I looked with wild and childish glee upon each golden gem, and when they bowed their heads so shy, I laughed and thought they danced for joy. And when a man in early years, how sweet they used to come, and give me tales of smiles and tears, and thoughts more dear than home. Secrets which words would then reprove, they told the names of early love. The primrose turned a babbling flower within its sweet recess. I blushed to see its secret bower, and turned her name to bless. The violets said the eyes were blue. I loved, and did they tell me true? The cowslips blooming everywhere, my heart's own thoughts could steal. I nipped them that they should not hear, they smiled and would reveal. And over each meadow, right or wrong, they sing the name I've worshipped long. The brook that mirrored clear the sky, full well I know the spot. The mouse-eared looked with bright blue eye, and said, forget me not. And from the brook I turned away, but heard it many an after day. The kingcup on its slender stalk, within the pasture dell, would picture there a pleasant walk, with one I loved so well. It said how sweet and eventide 'twould be with true love at thy side. And on the pasture's woody knoll I saw the wild bluebell, on Sundays where I used to stroll with her I loved so well. She culled the flowers the year before, these sowed and told their story over. And every flower that had a name would tell me who was fair, but those without as strangers came, and blossomed silent there. I stood to hear, but all alone. They bloomed and kept their thoughts unknown. But seasons now have naught to say, the flowers no news to bring. Alone I live from day to day. Flowers deck the byre of spring, and birds upon the brush or tree all sing a different tale to me. John Clare. Thank you so much for sitting and spending some slow stitching time with me. Please let me know in the comments what project you are working on. It's lovely to be part of a community of quilters and stitchers, sharing inspiration, offering encouragement, and creating beauty together. I hope you have enjoyed this first slow stitching vlog. I hope there will be many more to come. As always, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest. I also have my slow stitching journal, an email newsletter full of inspiration, tips and tricks, news on what's happening in my shop and what I'm working on. Over on the Maker Stash website, you can find my blog. In my latest post, I look back on the past 5 years being in business with the Maker Stash and share my plans for the future. You will also find my online shop where I'm currently running a 5th birthday sale with 20% off store-wide. Sale ends Saturday, February 17th, 2024. You can find links of all the places mentioned in the description box below this video. If you enjoyed this vlog, I'd love you to hit the like button and subscribe so that we can meet again over a cup of tea and some gentle slow stitching. Until next time, friend, I hope you have a beautiful day or night with lots of happy stitching.